In today's episode, we're fixing ropes, knocking over salt shakers, and maybe buying a boat. It's time for your Jewish Week. Hey everyone, welcome to Your Jewish Week, the podcast for everything Jewish in the week ahead. I'm Rabbi Dovi. As always, this podcast is produced by Chabad.org and dedicated to all our brothers and sisters in the Holy Land. May Hashem keep them safe from all harm, and may all the hostages finally be freed to return to their families and loved ones. Today is Sunday, the 17th of Tammuz, and it's a fast day. More on that soon. If you happen to be spending your week in the exact center of the USA, I mean the single point on the map that lies precisely in the middle of the contiguous United States, then I need to inform you that you're on private property. Please leave. If, however, you're hanging out at the publicly accessible marker near Lebanon, Kansas, about a half a mile away, disappointing, yes, but much more legal, you'll find Shabbat Candle Lighting Time this week coming in at 8:45 p.m. If you're anywhere else, halachic times for your location can be found quickly and easily at Chabad.org/times. Starting us off, as always, with the weekly Torah portion, this week we'll be learning the parsha of Pinchas. We begin on Sunday with Hashem commending Pinchas, the grandson of Aaron the high priest, whose decisive action at the end of last week's parsha halted a devastating plague and saved many Jewish lives. As a reward, Hashem grants Pinchas and his descendants the gift of priesthood. From now on, they will all be part of the dynasty of Kohanim. And the funny thing about this is that Kohanim are, by definition, descendants of Aaron, and Pinchas was, as we mentioned, his grandson. So why wasn't he a Kohen already? Well, there was one teeny crack in the dynasty of Kohanim, and Pinchas happened to fall right through that crack. When Hashem appointed Aaron as the high priest, he also appointed Aaron's sons as regular Kohanim and declared that all their future children would be Kohanim as well. Did you catch that little loophole? It's all their future children. But Pinchas just so happened to have already been born, so he missed out on the opportunity. But now, in light of his heroic actions, he and his descendants will be Kohanim as well. Having rewarded the heroes, it's time to punish the villains. Hashem commands Moshe to attack the Midianites, whose devious plot in last week's parsha had been the cause of all the death and suffering. And finally, right at the end of Sunday's reading, Moshe is commanded to count the Jews. Monday through Wednesday, we'll lay out the results of the census in detail and take the opportunity to delineate how the land of Israel will be split up between the various tribes after it is conquered. And that leads to an interesting episode right as we get into Wednesday's reading. 5 righteous sisters, the daughters of a man named Slavchad, come to Moshe and make the case that their father's portion of the land will be lost. Slavchad himself had died, and the laws of inheritance at that point did not provide for inheritance by daughters, only sons. It's a bit more complicated than that, but the bottom line is Moshe brings their case to Hashem, who commends their righteousness and their love for the Holy Land and clarifies the law in their case, granting them each a section of their father's estate, so everybody happy now. Also, in Wednesday's reading, Hashem begins preparing Moshe for his own passing. He directs Moshe to climb to a high vantage point where he can see the Holy Land, and they discuss arrangements for Moshe's successor, Yehoshua. On the same note, Hashem has Moshe once again remind the Jews about their sacrificial obligations to make sure that their devotion to Hashem doesn't fade when Moshe's influence is no longer directly compelling them. So Thursday to the end of the week, we'll be laying out the laws of the daily sacrifices and the special holiday offerings. This section right here is one of the most frequently read portions of the entire Torah. We read it every Rosh Chodesh, so that's once or twice a month, and the adjacent passages are read throughout the major holidays, so that's about a week at a time. For this reason, when someone is buying a used Torah scroll and wants to check the condition that it's in, they'll often open it to these passages right at the end of Parshas Pinchas, because they reflect how much wear and tear the scroll's gotten and what kind of shape it's in. Parshas Pinchas contains 168 verses, with the memory key being the word lechelek and the name Eliflehu. As always, check out the link in the show notes for more insight into this week's keys. In the weekly Tanya, we're continuing our discussion on the divine root of our souls, which is important to understand if you want to address the disconnect that a sin creates between us and Hashem. Starting from the beginning of the week, we're going to be using one particular visual as reference. Imagine two people, one higher up and one lower down, and those people are both holding on to two ends of a single rope. The rope is made of a bunch of tiny fibers, and when one person moves his end of the rope, the other person feels it. Now, all these details are going to serve as an analogy for our connection to Hashem, as we'll explore in this week's Tanya. It'll help us understand how even mild sins can gradually snip away at all the little strands that make up the rope of our divine bond, and it'll also really flesh out the process of teshuvah and the various aspects that come into play. Taking stock of our behavior, regretting our misdeeds, pleading for mercy from Hashem, and so on. As part of this discussion, we're also going to be peeking under the hood quite a bit, taking a look at some Kabbalistic ideas that define the source of our existence and reveal the spiritual ramifications of our actions. Moving on to the daily Rambam, the 3-chapter and Sefer HaMitzvos tracks are wrapping up the laws of Meiser early on Sunday before moving on to another type of tithe called Meiser Sheni. Like Teruma and Meiser Sheni is a tithe that must be taken from our produce, but instead of giving it to a Kohen or a Levite or a poor person, we're obligated to eat it ourselves. The only catch is it has to be eaten in Yerushalayim. There's a lot of laws attendant to that, which we'll cover going into Monday and Tuesday. In particular, you've got the question of someone who runs a sprawling farm, huge operation. How's he going to schlep all his Meiser Sheni produce to Yerushalayim and eat it without it spoiling? Well, luckily for him, the Torah provides a solution. You can redeem the produce with money and then use the money to purchase food in Yerushalayim. But of course, it's not that simple. There's quite a few laws governing the whole redemption and purchasing process, so buckle up. Wednesday will cover a very similar set of laws called Neta Ravai. When you plant a tree, the fruit that grows for the first 3 years is called arla. You can't harvest it. Interestingly, this is one of the reasons behind the Jewish custom of not cutting a boy's hair until he's 3 years old. Now, on the 4th year, the produce becomes permitted to eat, kinda. It's just like Meiser Sheni. You need to eat it in Yerushalayim, and we'll be going over all those laws on Wednesday. Thursday, I am so happy to announce that my tithe saying days are over, at least for this year. We'll describe the ritual announcement of completion that you say after all your tithes have been separated and given to the right places, and then we'll be moving on to a whole new tithe-free sets of laws. These laws are going to cover the various things that must be given to the Kohanim, such as our first fruits, known as the Bikurim, and a portion of our dough, which is called challah. We're going to be sticking with the laws of challah all the way to the end of the week and beyond. In the 1-chapter track, we're still on the laws of selling unusual stuff, starting off on Sunday with the case of someone who sells a ship. As we did last week, we'll determine what is and is not presumed to be included in the sale, and that involves going through all the parts and trimmings of a sailing vessel, which is always a lot of fun for me because I love everything about sailing ships. We'll be going through many other weird sale cases until Tuesday, when we'll pivot to discuss people who are not legally competent to sell things. There's 3 general categories with some subdivisions that we'll get into in the chapter. Wednesday, we'll discuss the case of one person who makes a sale on behalf of someone else, and with that, we conclude the laws of buying and selling that we've been studying for 30 straight chapters. Congratulations, everyone. Thursday, we'll embark on a new set of laws, the laws of acquiring ownerless things and gifts, which will continue throughout the end of the week and beyond. As always, if you'd like to learn more about anything you just heard, or if you're ready to join one of the daily study cycles, check out the show notes for links and resources. All right, with the weekly overview done, it's time to take it day by day. Sunday, the 17th of Tammuz, is a fast day, one of the 5 mandatory fast days on the Jewish calendar. It starts early in the morning, a bit before the sun actually comes over the horizon. So let's say you're still in Lebanon, Kansas, for instance. It'll be at 4:29 a.m. And of course, you could check out Chabad.org/times to find out when the fast starts for you. Of course, the fast day does not apply in cases of danger to health. So if you're not sure whether you're required to fast, consult your local rabbi. Now, there are several historical reasons for this day of fasting, which we'll get into in a minute, but from a halachic perspective, this fast day is going to kick off a 3-week period of mourning for the destruction of the Holy Temple from now until the fast of Tisha B'Av. During these 3 weeks, we avoid cutting our hair, listening to music, and holding weddings. And if that sounds familiar to you, it's because we just did the same thing for about 7 weeks during the period of Sphira, again, as a form of mourning. But as the saying goes, one action is better than 1,000 groans. The Rebbe tells us that the 3 weeks are an opportune time to study the laws concerning the Holy Temple, the layout of the building, the various vessels, and the furniture. And by doing this, we kind of contribute to its spiritual rebuilding and hasten the coming of Mashiach, may it be speedily in our days. Getting into the day in Jewish history, we've unfortunately got quite a few tragic events. First off, this was the day after the Jews made the golden calf, as we touched upon last week. So today, Moshe came down the mountain, saw what the people had done, and dropped the 2 tablets, shattering them. Now, I hopefully don't need to point out that Moshe was not a man given to temper tantrums. This was a calculated move that had several good reasons behind it, and ultimately Hashem himself actually thanked Moshe for doing it. I'll attach a link in the show notes if you want to know more. But the fact remains that the breaking of the tablets and the fact that it was necessary at all was a tragic thing, and it's one of the reasons we fast on this day. Around 900 years later, this same date was also the day that the Tamid sacrifices, the daily lamb which had been offered on the altar every morning and night since the days of Moshe, was interrupted. It was part of the worsening catastrophe that would later end with the Babylonians destroying the first Holy Temple 3 weeks later. During the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, the 17th of Tammuz earned another mark of infamy. It was the day when the Roman forces, who had been repulsed several times in pretty astonishing ways by Jewish guerrilla fighters, finally managed to break through the walls of Yerushalayim and enter the city itself. As it had with the First Temple, this day marked a turning point in the gradually worsening situation, which began to get rapidly even worse. It would eventually see thousands of Jews murdered, the Holy Temple destroyed, and a new period of exile begun that we are still living in today until Mashiach comes. It's also worthwhile to note that a Talmudic tradition recorded in the Jerusalem Talmud, which is distinct from the Babylonian Talmud that I usually mean when I say Talmud, says that the walls of Yerushalayim were also breached on this day during the destruction of the First Temple. So again, a lot of synchronicity here. Also on the 17th of Tammuz, a guy by the name of Apostomus burned a Torah scroll. This is a bit of an enigmatic event. It's recorded in the Mishnah as one of the reasons that we fast, but there's some very fascinating discussion as to who exactly this Apostomus was and which scroll he burnt. Some claim it was a Torah scroll written by Moshe himself, but I'll attach a link in the show notes to an article which lays it all out, and you can decide for yourself. Lastly, the Mishnah relates that the 17th of Tammuz was the day an idol was placed in the Holy Temple, which is obviously a tremendous desecration. But again, it's not clear exactly who did this or when it happened. You could read the Mishnah to say that Apostomus did it. This guy clearly was not a pleasant individual, or it could be read as a standalone phrase, in which case it might have happened much earlier, maybe during the reign of the Jewish king Menashe, which was during the First Temple period. Either way, quite a ghastly event, and one of the reasons that we fast on this day. Monday, the 18th of Tammuz, we've got another interesting event in the story of the destruction of the temple. At a certain point, Hashem commanded the prophet Yechezkel, also known as Ezekiel after the bread, I'll get to that in a minute, to perform several symbolic actions foretelling the coming siege of Yerushalayim and the eventual destruction of the Holy Temple. In the 4th chapter of Yechezkel, Hashem commanded him to lie on his left side for 390 days straight to atone for the sins of the kingdom of Yisrael, and then turn over and lie on his right side for 40 days to atone for the sins of the kingdom of Yehudah. Of course, as with all of Yechezkel's prophecies and all other prophets, in fact, there's much more here than meets the eye, but historically speaking, the 18th of Tammuz is recorded as the 391st day, when Yechezkel switched from his left side to his right. Now, while he was doing this side-lying regimen, Hashem instructed Yechezkel to eat a special bread that he was to make out of wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt. Quite an interesting recipe. A couple thousand years later, in 1964, a fellow by the name of Max Torres said, hey, we should make that for real. And turns out it was fantastic. And he began marketing it as Ezekiel bread, named after Yecheskel, who was also known as Ezekiel after the bread. All right, getting away from the destruction of the Holy Temple for a moment and onto some more cheerful topics, the 18th of Tammuz marks another one of those delightful local Purims that we love to feature on this show. This time, it's Purim Candia, established in 1538. And if you're wondering where in the world Candia is, a quick Google search tells me it's the old name of a city on the island of Crete. Actually, at one point in history, the entire island was known as the land of Candia, or Candi-land. But regardless, in 1538, the Jews of Candi-land were under attack from the local Greeks. As is so often the case in times of conflict, they were accused of helping the enemy. In this case, it was the Turks who were trying to conquer the island, maybe to get at some of the candy. Just when all seemed lost and a mob of angry people from Crete, a mob of angry cretins were effectively ransacking the Jewish quarter, the Jews were saved through several acts of remarkable divine providence and the wisdom of their Rabbi Eliyahu Kapsali. In commemoration of their salvation, they declare the 18th of Tammuz to be a local Purim. Wednesday, the 20th of Tammuz, is the yahrzeit of Rav Avram Chaim Noeh, a Chabad chassid and tremendously respected rabbinic authority of the 20th century. He passed away in 1954. If you've ever taken a peek at Jewish law, maybe some Mishnah, Talmud, or the Rambam, you'll very quickly realize that the Torah uses an interesting system of weights and measures. There's a whole bunch of different units subdivided into smaller units, just like we have today, but the basic units that the whole system stands on can be kind of hard to define. I'll give you an example. One of the basic units of measuring length in Jewish law is an amma. Now, the word amma roughly translates to an arm, and it's defined as the length of a man's arm, from shoulder to fingertips. You've also got thumb widths and finger lengths for smaller measurements, and occasionally even the width of a lentil. And then when it comes to volume, you'll see things like the volume of an egg or the volume of an olive. And the obvious question is, what in the world does all of that mean? Whose arm? What size egg? And it goes on and on. Well, one of the most enduring contributions that Rav Avram Chaim Noeh gave to the world of Torah scholarship was a work called Shiurei Torah, in which he took it upon himself to quantify all the weights and measures of the Torah into modern metrics using various techniques. His conclusions are widely relied upon by Jews all over the world, and as you can imagine, this is a massive deal. If it wasn't for Shiurei Torah, we'd all be stuck every Pesach, for example, trying to figure out how much matzah is equivalent to the volume of an olive, despite the fact that olives are small, spherical, and moist, and matzah is big, flat, and very, very dry, so they're about as different as two foods can be. Rav Avram Chaim Noeh also wrote the Ketzos HaShulchan, a lengthy work on Jewish law that is also heavily referenced and relied upon today. Thursday, the 21st of Tammuz, we've got the yahrzeit of Rabbi Eliyahu Baal Shem. He was one of several great mystics to be known by the title Baal Shem, which basically means you know how to manipulate reality using Kabbalah. I'll attach a link to an article with a bit more on that in the show notes. You most likely recognize the term Baal Shem after one of the most famous Baal Shems, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, who was born about 6 decades after Rabbi Eliyahu Baal Shem's passing. Friday, the 22nd of Tammuz, is the yahrzeit of Rav Shlomo Karliner, a colleague of the Alter Rebbe and the founder of his own Hasidic dynasty. Rabbi Shlomo Karliner was a very holy man, and in particular, there are many stories of his extraordinary fear of heaven. In fact, it was said about him that he trained himself to never fear anything or anyone besides Hashem himself, and that he became so skilled at this that he was actually able to go the other way. He could project fear of heaven into other people. And there's one remarkable story that illustrates this. I'll attach a link in the show notes to an article that brings it in detail, plus a whole lot more, so definitely check it out. But in brief, at one point, Rabbi Shlomo was sitting in a hotel when a high-ranking general walked in. So of course, everybody stood up out of respect, except for Rabbi Shlomo, who kept on acting like nothing happened. So the general, pretty insulted, stalks over to Rabbi Shlomo, who continues to ignore him, and knocks over the salt and pepper shakers on the table to get his attention. Real tough guy move, knock over the salt shaker, ooh. Well, he got his attention, but not in the way he'd hoped. Rabbi Shlomo Karliner lifted his head and looked the general full in the face, and instantly the general was seized by such a paralyzing fear that he straight up ran out of the building. Rabbi Shlomo was also fearless in his efforts to spread Hasidus, which was still a new movement and was getting some pretty hot backlash from many in the Jewish world. There were many Hasidic Rebbes who dealt with opposition, but Rabbi Shlomo lived particularly close to the city of Vilna, the heart of the anti-Hasidic movement, so he got it worse than pretty much anyone else. Eventually, he literally had to flee for his life. Nevertheless, he continued teaching Hasidus until his premature death at the hands of anti-Semitic Kazakh mobs. There's a story associated with that as well, which you can find in the article I mentioned earlier. Lastly, but not leastly, Shabbat, the 23rd of Tammuz, is Shabbos Mevorchim, the Shabbat in which we bless the new month. That takes place right before the Musaf section of our morning prayers. Hasidic custom is to wake up early to say the entire book of Tehillim, also known as Psalms, and gather in the synagogue after services to sing Pesei L'chaim and share inspiring thoughts with each other. In Jewish history, the 23rd of Tammuz marks the yahrzeit of Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, also known by the acronym Ramak, in 1570. The Ramak was one of the early Kabbalists, part of a group that lived and studied in the mystical town of Tzfas in the Holy Land. That group, by the way, was a pretty mind-blowing lineup. It's pretty rare to find so many huge names in Judaism all in one place at one time, learning from one another and growing together. Aside from the Ramak himself, you had his brother-in-law, Rabbi Shlomo Elkabetz, another legendary Kabbalist and the author of the Lecha Dodi that we sing on Friday night. You've also got Rabbi Yosef Karo, literally the author of the Code of Jewish Law. Now, he wasn't part of the group of Kabbalists per se, but he was very knowledgeable in Kabbalah and did in fact write a book of Kabbalah called Magid Meisharim. But overall, he was more well known for his contributions to the revealed parts of Torah, and he served as the head of the rabbinical court of Tzfas, along with the Mabit, Rabbi Moshe of Trani, another massive figure in Jewish law. Also in the Ramak circle, you had Rabbi Chaim Vital, who had become one of the biggest names in Lurianic Kabbalah, and right near the end of the Ramak's life, they were joined by the founder of Lurianic Kabbalah, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, the Holy Ari. The Holy Ari studied under the Ramak for the brief snippet of time that they spent together, and although he took a different approach to Kabbalah than the Ramak did, he respected him beyond words. And there's a famous teaching that the Arizal shared at the Ramak's funeral that illustrates this. There's a verse in the Torah that pertains to someone who commits a sin punishable by death and is then hung briefly on a wooden pole. It's a procedure that applies to certain cases of capital punishment. Well, the Arizal quoted the verse and then reinterpreted it word by word to reveal the inner meaning. The verse goes as follows, translating directly into English. If a man shall have a sin judged to death, you shall hang him on a tree. So here's how the Arizal interpreted it. He said like this: if you see a man, a perfectly righteous person, who lacks, the word chet can mean sin, but it could also mean lack, who lacks any apparent reason for being judged to death. In other words, every human being has some negativity within him. So when he passes away, you can kind of point to that negativity as almost the reason for his death. Of course, that doesn't mean he deserves to die. It just means he's an imperfect human like all other humans, and humans, as a rule, don't live forever. But what happens when you find someone like the Ramak, asks the Arizal, someone who's so pure and holy that he lacks negativity entirely? What explanation can you give for his death? So the Arizal answers by quoting the second half of the verse, you shall hang him on a tree. The Hebrew word for hang can also mean to attribute something. You attribute his death to the tree, the original tree of the sin of the tree of knowledge. After that sin, Hashem decreed that all of Adam's children, the human race, should be mortal. So even this flawless tzaddik, who otherwise does not have a single reason to die, he's got not a single negative mark on his record, must pass away as well. By applying this teaching to the Ramak, the Arizal was giving testimony to his exceptional righteousness. In fact, those who were present at his funeral said that they saw a pillar of fire accompanying his coffin, which is a heavenly privilege reserved for very few. Famously, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had something similar. May the memory of the Ramak bring merit to the entire Jewish people, and may we all see him, the Arizal, and all the other righteous sages of our past with the coming of Mashiach in the week ahead. Your Jewish Week is produced by Chabad.org, written and recorded by me, Rabbi Dovi Paltiel. Theme music by Levi Gloshak.